The bell rang, sharp and final, echoing through the cracked hallways of Jefferson High. It was fourth period, advanced calculus, and the air inside room 204 was thick with tension and boredom. Mr. Carter, the kind of teacher who wore his ego like a tie, tight and visible, tapped his marker against the whiteboard, his brow arched dramatically. "All right, geniuses," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see if any of you can actually solve something real today." He scribbled a long, twisting integral across the board. It snaked like a dragon, full of nested functions, and limits that made half the class wince just looking at it. Then came the punchline. "If anyone in here can solve this," he said, pausing for dramatic effect, "I'll give you an automatic A for the semester. In fact," he smirked, turning slightly toward the door just as it creaked open, "if even the janitor can solve it, I'll quit teaching." Laughter rippled through the room like wildfire. Elijah stepped into the classroom, mop bucket in. Terse. He wore his usual uniform, grey coveralls, worn boots, and an expression somewhere between peaceful and detached. He didn't react, just nodded politely, crossed to the corner, and began wiping the smudges off the other whiteboard. "Didn't mean any offense," Mr. Carter said loud enough for everyone to hear, not looking Elijah's way. "Just trying to make a point about capability." The joke hung heavy in the air. A few students giggled. One even whispered, "He probably thinks calculus is a cleaning product." Elijah paused for a moment at the board, his hand still holding the eraser. He looked at the integral. Just looked, like someone examining a painting in a museum. A slow, thoughtful gaze. Then, without a word, he picked up a dry erase marker from the tray and stepped to the main whiteboard, Mr. Carter's whiteboard. The class went silent. Even Mr. Carter's smirk faded slightly as Elijah began to write. Slow, deliberate, each symbol clean, each step methodical. It wasn't showy, it wasn't even fast, but it was correct. First derivative, substitution, rearranging, the bounds. The kind of solution that didn't just solve the problem but understood it. By the time Elijah reached the final answer, Mr. Carter had turned a shade paler. Aisha, a quiet girl in the second row, sat straighter in her seat. Her eyes followed every line like she was reading a language only two people in the room could speak. When Elijah capped the marker and turned back toward his mop bucket, he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The classroom was silent. No more laughter. No more jokes. Mr. Carter cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day, right?" No one laughed this time. Elijah gave a faint, tired smile. "Hey, broken clock still moves people, if you know how to read it." He wheeled the mop bucket out of the room, and just like that, he was gone. But something shifted in the room that day. You could feel it, like gravity had changed direction just a little. Mr. Carter turned back to the class, his voice unsure. "Okay, back to the lesson." But nobody was really listening, because the janitor just schooled the teacher. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? The smell of lemon cleaner clung to Elijah's clothes like memory. Every morning before the first bell, he walked the long hallways of Jefferson High, keys jingling at his side, mop in hand, eyes always scanning. Not just for spills, but for silence. He liked the quiet before the chaos. It gave him time to think, to breathe. Nobody ever asked who he was before the janitor uniform, and honestly, that's how he preferred it. But there was a time not too long ago when Elijah wore a different kind of uniform. A tweed blazer with elbow patches, a chalk-stained dress shirt, and a lanyard from MIT. Yes, that MIT. He used to lecture in auditoriums, not clean them. He used to teach calculus to graduate students. Now he cleaned gum off. Cafeteria tables. So what happened? The photo frame on his kitchen counter held the answer. A woman with bright eyes and a book in her hand, smiling under a cherry blossom tree. Her name was Mariah, his wife, his light. She died 3 years ago in a car accident on the way home from work. A delivery truck ran a red light. She never saw it coming. Neither did Elijah. Grief hit him like a freight train. No warning, no mercy. He stopped showing up to lectures, stopped returning emails. Eventually, he left the university with nothing. but a resignation letter and a broken heart. He packed up their tiny Boston apartment, took his daughter Aisha, and disappeared into the kind of small southern town where nobody cared about resumes or research papers. They needed janitors more than professors, so that's what he became. But the mind doesn't stop being brilliant just because the world stops applauding it. At night, Elijah still scribbled equations on napkins, still solved problems in his head while folding laundry, still whispered formulas under his breath like prayers. His love for math hadn't died, it had just gone underground. Like roots waiting for spring, Aisha never knew the full story. She was only 13 when they moved. Now 17, a junior at Jefferson High, she was smart, brilliant really, but too focused on surviving high school to dig into her father's past. She just knew he read old math journals with the same reverence some people give to scripture. She knew he smiled when she brought home equations, even when she said she hated them. And she knew he worked 2 shifts, never complained, and always made sure dinner was hot by 6. "Dad," she asked once, "why don't you do something else? Like teach again?" Elijah just smiled and ruffled her hair. "Some people teach with chalk, some teach with living. What matters is, the lesson gets through." Aisha didn't understand then. She would. The morning after the classroom incident, Elijah was quiet. He didn't mention what happened. He just poured 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with too much cream, and passed her a plate of eggs. But Aisha had heard the whispers at school. They were everywhere. "Did you see what the janitor did? I swear he solved it faster than he—" "Carter could. Yo, do you think he's like a secret genius?" She was used to people looking past her dad, but now they were looking at him, and they weren't laughing. She didn't know how to feel. Proud, confused, protective, maybe all 3. As Elijah walked into Jefferson High that day, pushing his mop bucket with its familiar squeak-squeak down the main hallway, a group of students parted to let him through. Some gave him nods. One kid, Lucas, whispered to his friend, "That's him." Elijah didn't acknowledge it, he just kept walking. But something had changed. For years he had blended in. Now people were starting to see. Mr. Carter slammed his briefcase down on the desk with a little more force than necessary. The students hadn't arrived yet, but he was already sweating. The buzz in the hallways, the side glances from fellow teachers, the "Hey, did you hear what happened in your class yesterday?" whispers, all of it gnawed at him like termites in his pride. He stared at the calculus problem Elijah had solved. It was still faintly visible on the whiteboard, a ghostly equation that refused to fade, even after 3 wipes. How? How could some janitor, not even a math teacher, a janitor, solve a problem in front of his class and make him look like a fool? He tried to brush it off last night, poured a glass of whiskey, told himself. It was a fluke, a guess. Maybe he saw it on YouTube or something. But no one writes a step-by-step breakdown of a triple integral with substitution and trigonometric identity unless they know exactly what they're doing. It was no guess. And that meant something he hated to admit. He'd been wrong. But Mr. Carter wasn't the kind of man to process shame in a healthy way. Instead, it turned to bitterness. He took it out on the next class. "Pop quiz," he barked without warning. 10 minutes, show all work." Groans filled the room. One brave student muttered, "Kinda harsh, don't you think?" Mr. Carter didn't flinch. "If you can't handle pressure, you shouldn't be here. Life doesn't give warnings." Neither do bruised egos, apparently. At lunch, in the faculty lounge, Mr. Carter sat alone, poking at his chicken sandwich, while the other teachers chatted near the coffee machine. Ms. Reynolds, the English teacher, sat down across from him, folding. Her arms? "You know, I thought what happened yesterday was kind of amazing," she said. Mr. Carter didn't look up. She continued, "That janitor, Elijah, right? He's got a gift. Maybe it's time we recognize it." Mr. Carter chuckled bitterly. "A gift, please. Solving one problem doesn't make you a mathematician." "He's got more degrees than you, James." That hit him square in the gut. Reynolds stood up, grabbing her tea. "You don't have to be the smartest guy in the room to be a good teacher. Just at the most humble." He didn't respond, because he couldn't. Meanwhile, in the hallway outside, Aisha was in a whirlwind of her own. Everywhere she went, people kept stopping her. "Wait, is your dad like a genius or something?" Was that really him who solved the problem? Yo, Aisha hooked me up with some of those genius genes. Some of it was curiosity, some admiration, but a lot of it felt like they were laughing at her, not with her. One girl, Brianna, smirked and said, "Dang, I wish my dad could clean and teach calculus. That's so quirky." Aisha narrowed her eyes. "He's not a punchline." Brianna raised her brows. Didn't say he was, but she didn't have to. That afternoon in the cafeteria, Aisha sat alone, headphones on, tapping her pencil on the table, but not really studying. Elijah had always told her to rise above ignorance, but he didn't have to walk through the jungle that was high school, with its petty cruelties and popularity contests. She did. She didn't know whether to be proud or mad or protective. Maybe all of it. And in a quiet corner of the school, Elijah was cleaning the boys' restroom, humming to himself. Peaceful, unbothered. The mop sloshed softly against the tiles. He wasn't thinking about Mr. Carter. He was thinking about parabolas, about symmetry, about how life sometimes drops you to your lowest point, only to launch you back up. Mr. Carter stood at the front of the classroom with a gleam in his eye, and not the good kind. It was the kind of gleam a man gets when his pride has been bruised, and all he wants is blood. Or, in this case, proof. He tapped the whiteboard with his marker. "Today we're doing something a little different." The class shifted in their seats. He wrote a new problem. Bigger, meaner, multivariable. The kind of integral you didn't see until your second year of college, if then. It took up the entire board, spilling across in long, complicated waves of symbols and substitutions. Lucas, sitting in the back, blinked. "Yo, what even is that?" "It's a challenge," Mr. Carter replied. "Let's see who's up for it." Then he did something nobody expected. He left the board untouched and walked over to the classroom door. Right on cue, Elijah was rolling his mop down the hallway. Mr. Carter stepped out. "Hey, Elijah," he said, his tone falsely friendly. "Got a sec?" Elijah paused. "Sure." "I was telling the students how math is a universal language," Carter said, voice carrying just enough to reach the front row. "And you know, since you had such a moment the other day, I thought maybe you'd like to take a crack at this one too." Elijah looked past him into the room. The board was full of nested integrals, partial derivatives, polar coordinates. A trap. He met Carter's eyes. "You want me to solve that? In front of your class?" "Why not?" Carter said with a shrug. "We could all learn something from a man of many talents." The word janitor hung unspoken between them. Elijah didn't flinch. He stepped into the room. The room fell silent as he walked in. Some kids took out their phones, not openly, but enough to catch the moment. He walked up to the board and stared at the equation. Read it twice. Thought for a moment. Then he turned around and picked up the marker. He didn't ask for paper or time, just began. What followed was art. He broke the equation down into manageable parts, labeled each section clearly, explained to the room calmly what he was doing at every step, like he wasn't being ambushed but invited. His voice was low but confident, like someone explaining the rules to a game he invented. And while he spoke, the classroom changed. Phones slowly dropped. Eyes moved closer. Even Carter stepped back, arms crossed but noticeably quiet. This wasn't a guess. It wasn't a show. This was mastery. When he boxed the final answer at the bottom corner of the whiteboard, Elijah stepped back and turned to Carter. "Sometimes," he said softly, "when you set a trap, you fall into it yourself." Mic drop. Mr. Carter opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, then finally, "Well, that was informative." Elijah gave a small, polite nod and walked out. But before he could reach the door, a voice from the back called out, "Wait, can we learn how you did that?" It was Lucas. Elijah paused. He looked at Carter, then at the students. "I'm here every day after school," he said. "If anyone wants to learn, you know where to find me." Then he was gone. Back in his seat, Carter stared at the board. The numbers weren't just right, they were beautiful, and that was the part that scared him most. By third period the next day, Jefferson High was buzzing like a hornet's nest. Did it again. Mr. Carter had to just stand there and take it. The janitor's not just smart, he's like Einstein level. Snapchats, TikToks, whispered conversations in the hallway. One clip had even made it to Reddit, titled, "School Janitor Solves Calculus Problem Teacher Couldn't Touch." Watch Mr. Carter's face. It had over 28,000 views by lunchtime. In the cafeteria, Aisha sat at her usual table, but nothing about today felt usual. Across the room, Brianna was showing a video to two other girls, covering her mouth like she was trying not to laugh. When Aisha glanced over, they stopped. Too late. She'd seen it, her hands clenched into fists under the table. Lucas sat down next to her with a tray full of chips and chocolate milk. "Yo, your dad's kind of famous now." "Don't call him that," she snapped. Lucas blinked. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" "I know," Aisha sighed, rubbing her forehead. "It's just, people aren't talking like it's cool, they're talking like it's a joke." "Nah," Lucas said. "Maybe some are, but most of us are just shook. He made Carter look like a rookie." Aisha looked down at her tray. She hadn't touched her food. "He didn't mean to embarrass anyone." "Doesn't matter. People remember when the underdog wins, especially when he's smarter than the guy in charge." Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Mr. Carter was not enjoying his cup of coffee. The principal, Mr. Henderson, stopped by with a concerned look. "James," he said gently, "you okay?" "Peachy." "I saw the clip," Henderson continued. "Didn't realize Elijah had that kind of background." Mr. Carter stared at the rim of his mug. "Neither did I." "Well, we're getting calls. Parents are asking why the janitor's teaching calculus better than the math department. Just giving you a heads up." Carter didn't respond. Down the hall, Elijah was scrubbing gum off the lockers. A small crowd of freshmen walked by. One of them whispered, "That's him." Another added, "He's like Good Will Hunting or something." Elijah didn't say a word. He just kept scrubbing, slow and steady. He didn't need applause, but he didn't need the stares either. That night, at home, Aisha slammed the front door a little too hard. Elijah looked up from his notebook. "Tough day?" "You think?" she said, dropping her backpack. "People either want me to explain how you did it, or they think it's hilarious that a janitor is smarter than their teacher." He set the notebook down and leaned back in the chair. "And what do you think?" "I think—" She hesitated. "I think I don't want you to be laughed at." Elijah smiled gently. "You ever hear the story of the lion who didn't care about the opinion of sheep?" Aisha rolled her eyes. "Dad," "Listen," he said, "people mock what they don't understand, and sometimes they fear what they can't control. That doesn't mean you stop being who you are." She sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders tight. "Why don't you just tell people who you used to be?" she asked. "Because who I used to be doesn't matter," Elijah said. "It's who I'm trying to be now that counts." Outside, the crickets were chirping. Inside, Elijah returned to his notebook, an open page full of equations, but in the corner, scribbled in small handwriting, were 5 words. "Never underestimate the overlooked mind." Before Jefferson High. Before. The mop and bucket. Before the teasing jokes and sideways glances, there was Elijah Turner, the youngest tenured professor at MIT's Department of Mathematics. At 32, he'd already published in 3 international journals, guest lectured in Seoul and Berlin, and developed a new teaching method for nonlinear systems that students swore actually made sense. But what people remembered most wasn't his credentials, it was how he taught. "Math isn't just numbers," Elijah used to say, standing before rows of exhausted students at 8 a.m., coffee in one hand, chalk in the other. "It's a language, it's a story. Every equation tells us something about the world. Our job is to listen." And they did. Even the hungover freshmen, even the grad students buried under dissertations, because when Elijah talked math, he made it feel alive. He'd pace in front of the chalkboard like he was conducting an orchestra. Slide into a problem, then pause with a grin. "Wait, did you feel that? That shift, that's where the magic happens." No one left his class without feeling like the universe had just whispered a secret in their ear. But for all his accolades and charisma, Elijah's real brilliance lived beyond the classroom, in a small walk-up apartment off Harvard Street, with one bookshelf too full and one woman too beautiful for words. Mariah, she wasn't a mathematician. She taught art at a local community center, ran a tiny gallery downtown, believed in color, chaos, and balance. Where Elijah saw logic, she saw wonder. Where he saw patterns, she saw passion. She was the one person who could pull him away from his equations and say, "Let's go watch the stars instead." They'd met at a bookstore, both reaching for the same copy of Siddhartha. 1 year later, they were married. On the day Aisha was born, Elijah skipped a panel at a global math summit. Didn't even blink. "She's better than any keynote," he said, holding his daughter for the first time. "She's my greatest theorem." Life was good, not perfect, but full of meaning, of motion, of love, until the day it all stopped. It was raining hard the night Mariah died. She was on her way home from setting up an exhibit at her gallery. A semi-truck took a turn too fast, T-boned her at an intersection 4 blocks from home. They said it was instant, as if that made it easier, as if anything could. After the funeral, Elijah stopped going to campus. Emails went unanswered, papers went unwritten. For the first time, the equations didn't speak to him. The chalk felt heavy in his hands. The classroom felt like a ghost town. He tried going back once, tried standing in front of a room full of bright-eyed students again, but when he picked up the chalk, all he could see was Mariah's smile, then the void where it used to be. He lasted 6 minutes before walking out mid-lecture. No words, just silence. It took months to pack up the apartment, even longer to breathe without breaking down. Eventually, Elijah took Aisha and left Boston. No forwarding address, no final lecture. He looked for somewhere quieter, somewhere anonymous, somewhere the world wouldn't expect anything from him. That place was Jefferson. People assumed things about him when he got there. They saw the quiet man with calloused hands and thought he was simple. They saw the mop and missed the mind. And Elijah let them, because some pain doesn't need to be corrected. It just needs to rest. But now something was changing. The classroom incident, the problem on the board, the whispering students, the stairs in the hallway. Something was waking up inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A fire, not anger, not pride, purpose. At 3:17 p.m., room 204 should have been empty, but that Thursday afternoon, as the final bell echoed through Jefferson High, a strange thing happened. Students stayed, not for detention, not for makeup tests. They stayed for Elijah. Lucas was the first to slide into a desk near the front, nervously clutching his beat-up graphing calculator. 2 girls from the AP Calc class followed. Then Aisha, who stood in the doorway for a second before quietly taking a seat in the back. By 3:25, there were 13 students. By 3:40, 17. And at 3:41, Elijah walked in carrying nothing but a dry erase marker and a yellow legal pad. He paused when he saw them. No surprise on his face, just a calm nod like he'd been expecting them all along. "You sure you're in the right room?" he asked with a grin. Lucas chuckled. "Yeah, we're not here for Mr. Carter," someone muttered. "Obviously." Elijah smiled wider. "All right then, let's make this interesting." He didn't start with a lecture. He started with a question. What's the one thing about calculus that confuses the hell out of you? It caught them off guard. In class, they were used to being told what they didn't know, not being asked. After a few moments, hands went up. Elimination rules for limits. The whole concept of continuity still messes me up. Implicit differentiation, like, what even is that? Elijah nodded thoughtfully. Good, keep going. He filled the whiteboard with their confusion like a menu. Then one by one he broke it all down, not with formulas at first, but with stories. You ever drive up a hill that gets steeper the farther you go? That's a limit. Ever wonder how your GPS knows where you're going next? That's derivatives. Math isn't magic, it's instructions written in another language. Eyes lit up. Even Aisha, arms folded, was leaning forward without realizing it. For an hour, the room felt electric. They weren't just learning, they were understanding, and they weren't being taught by a janitor. They were learning from a master. Meanwhile, in the front office, Mr. Carter was hunched over his laptop, jaw tight, eyes locked on the screen. He had found it. Elijah Turner, former MIT professor of applied mathematics. Specialization, complex systems. Published, 12 peer-reviewed articles. Last lecture, March 12, 2022. He clicked through PDFs and video clips, lectures from international conferences, interviews on podcasts, even a TEDx talk titled, "The Math Behind the Music of the Universe." Carter sat back in his chair. So it was true. The janitor wasn't just some anomaly. He was once a star, and Carter hadn't just been shown up. He'd been exposed. Back in room 204, the students were packing, up, buzzing with energy. Lucas fist-bumped Elijah on the way out. Seriously, this was better than an entire semester. Aisha lingered at the back of the room. She didn't say anything right away, just watched him erase the board, calm as ever. Finally, "You're really doing this, huh?" Elijah looked at her. "Doing what?" "Teaching again." He paused. "Feels like the lessons never really left me. Just needed someone to ask for them." She gave a small smile. "You're going to change this place, you know that?" Elijah shook his head, gently. "No, we are." The next day, there was a tension in the air at Jefferson High that couldn't be ignored. Even the air conditioning in the hallways felt different, like everything was holding its breath. There were whispers behind every classroom door. The rumor, Mill was spinning at full force, and Mr. Carter was at the center of it all. By lunchtime, Carter had made up his mind. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't just pretend that nothing had changed, that the janitor turned math genius was still sweeping floors in the corner. Elijah Turner was a threat, and Carter wasn't about to lose control of his own. Classroom. The bell rang sharply at 12:45, and by 12:47 Carter was at the janitor's closet. He knocked once, sharply. Elijah. The door opened, but Elijah didn't say anything. He just stood there, wiping his hands on a rag, his face unreadable. "Can we talk?" Carter asked. Elijah stepped back and motioned him in. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Carter stepped inside, the small closet barely big enough for the two of them. It smelled of cleaning supplies and the faint musk of old mop water. "I know what you've been doing after school," Carter began, voice low but firm. "And I need to know why." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb," Carter shot back. "You've been teaching those kids math, real math. And you know what? It's not just calculus. It's my curriculum. My students. I don't need you coming in and making me look like a joke." Elijah folded his arms slowly. "Look, I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't come here to cause problems." "But you did," Carter snapped. "You've got them all thinking you're some kind of math wizard, and you've got parents calling my office now. You don't just waltz in and start teaching because you feel like it." There was a long pause. Then Elijah's voice was calm but piercing. "Maybe they're learning something, James. Maybe they're not just sitting there being told they don't get it. Maybe you should think about why that is." Carter's face twisted in frustration. "I've been teaching here for years. What makes you think you can just walk in and steal my students?" Elijah's eyes locked onto Carter's with a quiet intensity. "I'm not stealing anything. They asked. They needed more than what you could give them. And it's not about me, James. It's about them. If I'm the one who can show them something new, then that's what I'm going to do. Even if you don't like it." Carter clenched his fists. "So what, you think you're just going to waltz in here and take over my class? I won't let that happen." Elijah shook his head slowly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here because I can't ignore a group of kids who actually want to learn. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." There was a heavy silence. Finally, Carter spoke, voice low. "You think you can just waltz in here and play the hero, huh? You think you've got it all figured out?" "No," Elijah replied quietly. "But I know enough to see when someone's lost sight of what's important." The room felt small, tense. Elijah turned away and picked up his mop, starting to drag it across the floor, as if the conversation had already ended. For a moment, Carter stood there, fists still clenched at his sides, mind whirring. It felt as though every word he'd said had only made things worse. It wasn't about the students anymore. It was about his pride. It was about feeling like he was still in control. Finally, Carter exhaled sharply. "This isn't over, Elijah." Elijah didn't look back. He just kept mopping, slow and steady. "No, it's not." And with that, Carter turned on his heel and walked out. As the door slammed behind him, Elijah stood silently, his eyes narrowing as he considered the man who had once been his peer, the man who now felt like an enemy. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He had nothing left to prove. By Monday morning, the walls of Jefferson High were practically vibrating with energy. It wasn't just the students who had noticed the change. The school board had caught wind of the rising tension. Emails were being exchanged, phone calls were being made, and suddenly Elijah Turner's unexpected role as the janitor turned math tutor had turned into something far more complicated. But the real shocker came when Mrs. Langley, the principal, called an emergency meeting, and she wasn't alone. At 2:15 p.m., Elijah found himself sitting in a small conference room facing a dozen stern faces. Mrs. Langley sat at the head of the table, her glasses perched high on her nose, and a clipboard in hand. Beside her sat a man in a suit, Mr. Peterson, the district superintendent, and a few others who Elijah recognized as members of the school board. This wasn't a casual meeting. This wasn't just a discussion about his extracurricular activities. This was an intervention. Mrs. Langley cleared her throat. "Mr. Turner, thank you for joining us today. We need to address what's been happening here at Jefferson." "Hi." Elijah remained silent, leaning back in his chair. He had been expecting this. He had been bracing for it ever since he first walked into that classroom and changed the lives of those students. "Your actions after school last week have raised some serious concerns," Mrs. Langley continued. "You've been teaching calculus, without any oversight, and we've received numerous complaints from both parents and faculty about the lack of proper authorization." Elijah's eyes flicked to Mr. Peterson, who was sitting with his arms folded, a tight-lipped expression on his face. "Some believe," Mrs. Langley went on, "that your, how should I put this, unconventional approach to teaching is undermining the educational structure here at Jefferson. Others are simply worried about your qualifications." Elijah narrowed his eyes, but his voice remained calm. "What I've been doing is teaching the students who want to learn. They've been asking me for help, and I'm giving it to them. I'm not doing this to undermine anyone. I'm doing this because they need it." Mrs. Langley gave him a pointed look. "The problem, Mr. Turner, is that the students aren't the ones who pay the bills. The parents, the teachers, and the school district, they all have a say in what happens here. And right now this is not part of the approved curriculum. But they're learning," Elijah said, his voice rising just slightly. "I'm not just throwing out equations. I'm showing them how to think. I'm showing them that math isn't a dead end, it's a tool for understanding the world." Mr. Peterson finally spoke, his voice cold and direct. "You're not a licensed teacher. Mr. Turner, you're a janitor, and while I respect your education, you're overstepping your bounds here." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down. "I'm not doing this for my ego, Mr. Peterson. I'm doing this because it matters. I'm not asking to be in charge. I'm not asking for a paycheck. I'm just asking for the chance to help the kids who need it most." There was a moment of silence in the room, and then Mrs. Langley folded her hands in front of her and looked at him. "You want to help the students? Fine. But we're going to need to make some official adjustments. If you're going to teach these kids, it needs to be under the supervision of a licensed educator. You'll have to report directly to the math department, and we'll need written approval from the school board before any further tutoring sessions can happen. And if we find that this is causing any more disruption, we will have no choice but to suspend your extra duties here." Elijah didn't flinch. He knew this was coming, but it still stung. "I understand," he said quietly. As the meeting wrapped up, Elijah left the room with a heavy heart, the weight of their words hanging over him. But as he walked down the hallway, he wasn't alone. A small group of students, Lucas, Brianna, Aisha, and a few others, were waiting outside the door. Their faces were a mix of concern and defiance. Aisha stepped forward. "You okay?" Elijah looked at her and forced a smile. "I'll be fine." "I don't get it," Lucas muttered. "Why is everyone so mad?" "You're just helping us learn." Brianna shook her head. "They're scared, man. They don't want the kids to know that someone else, someone like you, can teach us better than the teacher. Elijah stopped and looked at all of them, his chest swelling with pride. I didn't start this to prove anyone wrong. I started this because you guys matter. You deserve more than being told that you don't understand something just because it's too hard. You're all capable, and you don't need anyone's permission to be smart. Aisha looked at him with fire in her eyes. You don't need to do all this for us, you know. We're behind you, we'll fight for you. Elijah smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. I appreciate that, Aisha, but you don't have to fight anyone. You just have to keep pushing forward. That's how you win. But as Elijah walked back to the janitor's closet, the world around him felt a little heavier. The battle was far from over. The next morning, the air in the halls of Jefferson High was thick with anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire that the school board was making a decision about Elijah's future, whether he'd remain just a janitor or be allowed to continue teaching the students who had come to see him as a mentor. By 8 a.m., the entire student body knew that a vote was set to take place during that day's faculty meeting, and though Elijah had been invited to attend, he wasn't sure whether he should be nervous or relieved. He'd been walking the line for so long. He had one foot in the world of custodial work and another in the realm of mathematics, and he had never really been officially part of either world. But over the past week, he had gained something more important than any title, the trust of his students. Now that trust was about to be tested. At 3 p.m., Elijah stood outside the teacher's lounge, hands in his pockets. He watched the teachers trickle out, looking at him with quiet, almost calculating glances. Some gave nods of acknowledgement, some avoided his eyes entirely. Mrs. Langley was the first to approach. "Well," she said, her voice softer than before. "The decision's been made." Elijah nodded, though his heart was racing. "What's the verdict?" She paused, studying him for a moment. Finally, her lips curled into a small, reluctant smile. "They've voted in your favor. The school board has decided to allow you to continue tutoring the students under official supervision." Elijah blinked, taken aback. He had expected a lot more resistance, a lot more pushback. Instead, it was almost as if they'd made their decision, because they were forced to. "And the catch?" Elijah asked, the tension in his voice betraying his curiosity. "The catch," Mrs. Langley said with a sigh, "is that you'll have to report directly to Mr. Carter. You'll be working with him, side by side. He'll be overseeing your sessions, making sure they align with the curriculum. But," she added, "you'll still be able to teach your students." Elijah nodded, not entirely satisfied, but grateful nonetheless. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As he walked back toward the janitor's closet, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. This wasn't exactly what he had hoped for. But it was a compromise, one he'd have to accept, at least for now. What bothered him more than anything, though, was the feeling that this was just a stepping stone. The idea of reporting to Carter, the very man who had undermined him, was a constant thorn in his side. But he didn't have a choice. By the time Elijah made it back to the janitor's closet, his mind was already racing. He had a lot to think about. The students depended on him. They needed him to keep pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They didn't deserve to have their curiosity squashed by a system that was too rigid, too focused on conformity. That afternoon, as he mopped the floors, Elijah's thoughts drifted to the students, Lucas, Aisha, Brianna, and the others who had supported him from the beginning. They had so much potential, so much untapped brilliance, and he couldn't help but wonder, how far could they go if they were given the right guidance, and what could he do to make sure they weren't held back? Just as he finished up for the day, Lucas appeared at the door of the closet, a faint smile on his face. "You look like you're deep in thought," Lucas said. Elijah smirked. "You could say that. What's up?" "I heard the news," Lucas said, eyes shining. "You're staying, right?" "I am," Elijah replied, giving a small nod. "Under a lot of conditions, but I'm still here." "That's awesome," Lucas said. "You know, you're kind of a hero around here now. Everyone's talking about what you did for us. It's not just about the math anymore. It's about the way you believe in us." Elijah met his eyes, his heart swelling with pride. You guys believe in yourselves, that's what matters. As Lucas walked away, Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. He took it out, unlocking the screen to see a message from Aisha. Aisha, you're not just a teacher, you're a change maker. Don't let them box you in. We've got your back, always. A slow smile spread across Elijah's face. It wasn't just about teaching anymore. It was about creating something bigger, something that would outlast any fight, any challenge. As he walked to his car, Elijah made a promise to himself. No matter what it took, he would keep fighting for those kids. He would show them that there was more to life than being told what they couldn't do. They were capable of greatness, and he would be the one to help them realize it. The first official tutoring session under the watchful eye of Mr. Carter was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Elijah had been mentally preparing for days. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Carter had made it clear from the beginning that he didn't want Elijah in his space, and now they were forced to share it. But what choice did Elijah have? He had a responsibility to his students. He couldn't back down now, not when so many kids were depending on him. As Elijah walked into the classroom that Thursday, the students were already waiting, their usual chatter dying down when they saw him. The energy in the room was different. It wasn't the usual enthusiasm, it was uncertain. They were looking at him, but they were also glancing at the door, waiting for Mr. Carter to show up. Elijah took a deep breath and smiled at them, trying to push past the nervousness. "All right, let's get started," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to do something a little different today, but before we begin, I need to remind you of one thing. You're capable of doing this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Brianna raised her hand. "But what about Mr. Carter? Isn't he going to mess everything up?" Elijah paused, biting his lip. He could feel the weight of the question. He didn't have an answer for that, not yet. "Mr. Carter's here to help. We're going to make it work, all right?" The students nodded, but there was a hesitation in their eyes. Elijah understood. They didn't just trust him, they trusted each other. They were a team, and he wasn't sure how they were going to handle this sudden intrusion. Moments later, Mr. Carter walked into the room, his footsteps heavy. He gave Elijah a curt nod and stood at the back of the class, arms crossed. His presence was imposing, and Elijah could feel the weight of it in the room. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I'll be observing today," Carter said, his voice loud and clear. "Make sure the students stay on task." Elijah's eyes flicked to him briefly, before he refocused on the board. He could feel the eyes of the students on him, but he forced himself to ignore the tension in the air. It was just one more obstacle. He could handle it. For the first half of the session, everything went as planned. Elijah guided the students through a series of complex calculus problems, offering tips, tricks, and encouragement. Brianna was on fire, solving problems faster than anyone had expected. Lucas, usually more hesitant, was beginning to grasp concepts he had once thought impossible. The students were learning, but then it happened. Mr. Carter cleared his throat loudly from the back of the room. "Elijah," he said, cutting through the quiet hum of the class, "you're teaching them the wrong way. This isn't how it's supposed to be done. You need to focus on the basics before diving into the more advanced topics." The students stiffened. Elijah felt the sting of Carter's words, but he didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the board, taking a moment to gather himself before responding. "I'm teaching them the way they need to learn," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "The basics don't always work for everyone. I'm pushing them because I know they can handle it." "That's not your call to make," Carter shot back, his voice colder now. "It's mine." A silence fell over the room. The students looked back and forth between the two men, unsure of what would happen next. The air felt thick, suffocating. Elijah turned to face Carter, his gaze steady but intense. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's your class, but these students have more potential than you give them credit for, and I'm not going to hold them back just to fit into your system." Carter's face tightened, but he said nothing. The tension between them was palpable, a quiet storm just waiting to break. Finally, Mrs. Langley appeared at the door, her expression serious. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her eyes darting between the two men. Elijah shook his head. not taking his eyes off Carter. "No problem at all, just some differences in teaching methods." Mrs. Langley studied both of them, and for a moment Elijah could see the doubt in her eyes. But then she nodded and turned to leave, not saying another word. The session continued, but the spark that had been in the air earlier had died down. The students, though still engaged, were now quieter, more reserved. They could feel the tension that had started to fill the room. No one wanted to be in the middle of this battle, and neither Elijah nor Carter could afford to back down. As the bell rang to signal the end of the session, Elijah packed up his things in silence, trying to ignore the weight of the entire situation. The students filed out slowly one by one, offering him quiet smiles or thumbs up. But when Lucas passed him at the door, he stopped. "You okay?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice full of concern. Elijah looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, we're going to be fine." As the last student left the room, Elijah turned to face Mr. Carter. The air between them was still charged, and Elijah knew it wouldn't take much for it to boil over again. But there was something he had to say. "I'm not here to replace you," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "I'm here to help these kids, and if you can't see that, then maybe it's time for you to rethink who's really teaching them." Carter opened his mouth to retort, but Elijah didn't wait for him to respond. He turned and walked out of the classroom, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the hallways. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest, but there was a part of him that felt lighter than he had in days. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But at least he was standing his ground. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Elijah's tutoring sessions were still in full swing, and while his students were getting better every day, the tension between him and Mr. Carter had only deepened. Carter had taken a more passive-aggressive approach, subtly questioning Elijah's methods at every turn. He would nitpick over details, making Elijah feel like he was constantly being scrutinized, and that made it harder to focus on the students who were counting on him. But the real trouble came on Friday afternoon, when Elijah received an unexpected call from Mrs. Langley. "Mr. Turner, could you please come to my office? There's something we need to discuss." Her tone was professional, but there was an underlying tension in her voice that Elijah couldn't ignore. He could already feel the weight of what was coming. When he arrived at her office, the door was open and Mrs. Langley was sitting at her desk. She looked up at him and gestured for him to sit down. As Elijah lowered himself into the chair, he noticed that the atmosphere in the room was different. It wasn't just Mrs. Langley in here. Mr. Peterson, the district superintendent, was sitting across from her, his arms folded tightly. He was flanked by two other members of the school board, both wearing stern expressions. "We've been having some concerns, Mr. Turner," Mr. Peterson began, his voice smooth but sharp. "Your tutoring sessions have drawn a great deal of attention. Not just from students and parents, but from faculty as well." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about Mr. Carter anymore, this was bigger. "We've received complaints from several staff members about the way you're handling the students. They feel that you're overstepping your boundaries, particularly with the advanced material you're teaching," Mr. Peterson continued. "And some parents are upset about the fact that you're not a licensed teacher." Mrs. Langley cleared her throat, and Elijah could see the strain in her eyes. "The decision we've made is this. We've decided that your tutoring sessions will be suspended for the time being." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. "Suspended?" Elijah's voice cracked, but he quickly steadied himself. "You can't be serious." "We are," Mrs. Langley said, her expression firm but apologetic. "We can't allow you to continue teaching in an unofficial capacity. The district can't risk being sued for something that's outside the rules. We have to follow protocol." Elijah looked around the room, but no one seemed to meet his eyes. The coldness of their stares made his blood run cold. "But they're learning," Elijah said, his voice rising in frustration. "These students are progressing. You can't just take that away from them." Mr. Peterson's gaze hardened. "We understand that you're passionate, but we can't allow this to continue without the proper qualifications. This is about more than just the students. It's about the integrity of our system." The words stung. Elijah's mind raced. He thought about Lucas, Brianna, Aisha, the students who had come to him for help, the students who needed him. "I'm not asking for a paycheck," Elijah said, his voice quieter now. "I'm not asking for recognition, I'm just asking for the chance to help these kids. Isn't that what you're supposed to be doing too?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, Mr. Peterson sighed and shook his head. "We've made our decision. The tutoring program is suspended until further notice. We will reassess the situation in the coming weeks." Elijah stood up, his body rigid. "This isn't over." He turned to walk out, but before he could reach the door, Mrs. Langley called, after him, "Mr. Turner, please understand. We're not trying to stop you from helping. But this has to be done the right way. Please, don't make this harder than it already is." But Elijah didn't stop. He walked out of the office, the door closing with a soft click behind him. As Elijah left the building, the weight of the decision pressed down on him harder than ever. This wasn't just about his role as a tutor anymore. This was a direct challenge to everything he'd worked for. The belief that learning didn't have to be confined to a classroom. The belief that students didn't have to fit into a rigid system that failed to see their potential. Outside, the wind was bitterly cold, but it didn't bother Elijah. He had no idea where he was going, but his feet carried him toward the familiar path behind the school, the place where he usually cleared his mind. "Hey," a voice called out behind him. Elijah turned to see Lucas and Brianna running up to him, both of them panting slightly as if they had been running to catch up. "What's going on?" Lucas asked, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "We heard the meeting didn't go well." Elijah nodded grimly. "Yeah, they've suspended the tutoring sessions. They don't want me teaching anymore." Brianna's eyes widened. "What? But you're the reason we're getting it. We were failing before you stepped in. You've taught us more in a week than any of those teachers did all semester." Elijah forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know, and I'm proud of all of you for pushing yourselves to be better." "What can we do?" Lucas asked, frustration lacing his voice. "We can't let them just take this away from us." Elijah looked at them, his heart heavy. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out. I promise you we're not giving up." That evening, as Elijah sat in his tiny apartment staring out the window, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Aisha. "Aisha, we're with you, Elijah. We'll fight this. Let's talk tomorrow. You're not alone." A small spark of hope ignited in Elijah's chest. Maybe he couldn't fight this on his own, but with his students by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Elijah woke up to a phone buzzing relentlessly on his bedside table. When he reached for it, he saw dozens of texts, some from students, some from friends. But one message stood out the most. "Lucas, we're not letting them. Shut us down. Brianna and I started a petition last night. We'll get this to the school board. We're not giving up, Elijah, not now. Not ever." Elijah couldn't help but smile, despite the heavy weight still sitting on his chest. His students weren't just sitting back and letting things happen to them. They were taking matters into their own hands. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't just the petition, it was everything. The belief in what he was doing, the trust, the community he'd built within those few short weeks. By lunchtime, Elijah received word that the petition had gone viral within the school. It was quickly circulating on social media, with students and even some teachers joining the cause. They were rallying behind him, and it was clear that this wasn't just about a tutor anymore. It was about their right to be taught in a way that worked for them, to have someone who actually cared. Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and fear all at once. Pride because the students were fighting for something that was theirs, something that could change the way they learned. Fear because he knew that the school board wasn't going to let this slide. They were powerful, and the consequences could be severe. As the day went on, more students came up to Elijah with their own words of encouragement. Aisha stopped by during lunch, holding a stack of flyers. "We're getting people to sign up," she said, determination in her voice. "The petition is growing every minute. We've got this." "What if it doesn't work?" Elijah asked, the doubt creeping in despite his best efforts to stay hopeful. "What if the board just ignores us?" Aisha smiled. "It's not about them listening, Elijah. It's about showing them that we're not going to sit quietly. We're going to be heard. and we'll make sure they know exactly why this is important." For the first time in days, Elijah felt a little bit of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe this was just the beginning. By the time the final bell rang, the petition had gained over 500 signatures. Students, teachers, even some parents had signed on. And Elijah knew that this was bigger than just a single tutor and his fight. This was about a change in the system, a recognition that education should be about the students, not about the rules that confine them. The next day, Elijah was standing outside the principal's office when Mrs. Langley walked by, pausing when she saw him. "Elijah, you're here early," she said, offering him a tight smile. "I need to talk to Mr. Peterson," Elijah said, standing tall. "I think it's time we had a real conversation about what's going on here." Mrs. Langley glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if to make sure no one was listening. "I've seen the petition," she said quietly. "I think you should know that this is a serious matter. If it goes too far, they might have to take more drastic measures. The school board won't take kindly to this." Elijah's gaze hardened. "I'm not backing down, Mrs. Langley. I'm fighting for these kids. I'm fighting for their right to learn, for their right to have a teacher who believes in them." "I know you believe in them," she said, her voice softening. "But this is more than just about you and them, Elijah. It's about the system. And the system isn't designed for change. Not like this." "But it should be," Elijah replied, his voice unwavering. "The system should be designed for change. Because if it doesn't change, we're going to keep losing kids like them. Smart, capable kids who just need a little help, a little push. They don't need to be trapped in a box." For a moment, there was silence between them. Mrs. Langley studied him, as if weighing her next words carefully. "You have my support," she finally said. "But you have to be prepared for what's coming. They won't go down without a fight." Elijah nodded, a steely resolve settling over him. "I'm ready." That afternoon, the students rallied outside the school. The flyers Aisha had printed were scattered everywhere, on lockers, in the halls, and in every student's hand. They were chanting Elijah's name, holding signs that read, "Free to learn, and let us learn the way we can." Elijah stood at the front of the crowd, feeling a rush of emotions as he saw how many had gathered. He wasn't in this alone anymore. The loudspeakers crackled, and Aisha stood at the front of the crowd, microphone in hand. "We're not going to stop until we get the education we deserve," she shouted. "Elijah is our teacher, and we won't let them take that away from us." The cheers that followed were deafening, and for a brief moment Elijah allowed himself to feel the weight of the moment. This was more than just about him. It was about standing up for what was right. But as the crowd began to thin out and the students trickled back inside the school, Elijah's phone buzzed once more. This time it was an email from Mrs. Langley. "Mrs. Langley, the school board has requested a meeting with you, Elijah. It's happening tomorrow morning. Be prepared." Elijah looked at the screen, his stomach tightening. He knew this wasn't just a meeting. This was the final showdown. But he wasn't backing down. Not now. The morning of the meeting arrived, and the air felt thick with anticipation. Elijah stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, adjusting the collar of his shirt. He wanted to look professional, but the nervous energy bubbling inside him made it impossible to feel fully composed. His stomach churned, not from fear, but from the pressure of what was at stake. He was no longer just fighting for his students' right to be taught. This had turned into something bigger, a movement, a challenge to a system that had failed so many, especially students like Lucas, Brianna, and Aisha. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. He arrived early, knowing that first impressions mattered. Mrs. Langley had warned him that the school board would be coming in full force. He wasn't sure if that was meant to intimidate him, but he wasn't scared. He had the support of hundreds of students, parents, and even some teachers. As he walked down the corridor to the conference room, the sounds of distant chatter filled the hall. The conference room door was slightly ajar, and he could see the figures of Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Langley, and others sitting at the long table, their faces grave. When Elijah entered, all eyes turned to him. Mrs. Langley gave him a small nod of encouragement, but Mr. Peterson's face was unreadable. "Elijah Turner," Mr. Peterson said, his voice cold as he gestured to the seat across from him. "Please have a seat. We need to have a serious conversation." Elijah sat down slowly, folding his hands in front of him. He wasn't going to let them see him sweat. This was his moment to make his case, to prove that what he was doing was worth fighting for. "I assume you're aware of the petition and the support you've gained over the last few days," Mr. Peterson began, tapping his pen against the table. "Over 700 signatures from students, parents, and teachers. This is no small matter." Elijah nodded. "Yes, and I believe it speaks to the fact that the system is broken. My students, your students, are begging for a change. And I'm asking you to listen to them." There was a brief silence as Mr. Peterson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "We've reviewed the situation, Elijah, and while we understand your passion, we also have a responsibility to maintain standards, to ensure that our teachers are properly trained, certified, and following the curriculum set forth by the district." "I understand that," Elijah said, his voice steady. "But what you're not seeing is that the traditional system isn't working for every student. The ones who struggle, the ones who don't fit the mold. What happens to them? They fall through the cracks. I'm here to catch them." Mr. Peterson raised an eyebrow. "And you think that you, an unlicensed tutor, are better suited to teach these kids than certified professionals?" Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "What I'm doing isn't about being better. It's about being what these kids need. I may not have a teaching degree, but I have something just as valuable, a willingness to adapt, to listen to them, and to provide them with a real, hands-on education. I see them, I hear them, and I'm willing to go the extra mile to make sure they succeed." A murmur rippled through the room as Elijah's words sank in. He could see the faintest glimmer of doubt in some of their eyes, but Mr. Peterson wasn't moved. He leaned forward, folding his hands. "You're asking us to go against the rules, to throw away years of established procedures. You're asking just to risk the reputation of this district, and possibly our jobs, because you think you know better." "I'm not asking you to throw away the rules," Elijah countered. "I'm asking you to think about what the rules are actually doing to these kids. The system was built for some, but not for all, and that's where it's failing. I'm simply asking for the chance to prove that we can do better." Mrs. Langley had been quiet up until now, but she finally spoke. "I've seen the results of Elijah's tutoring firsthand. The kids are more engaged, more motivated. They're learning in ways they've never been able to before. And I believe that what he's doing has merit." Mr. Peterson looked over at her, then back at Elijah. "This is all well and good, but we have policies. If we make an exception for you, it will set a precedent. What will we tell the other districts? What about the other students who didn't have access to your kind of tutoring?" Elijah stood up, his heart racing but his mind clear. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for an opportunity to change the system, just one step at a time. This could be the beginning of something bigger. We could be the district that leads the way in innovative education, the district that isn't afraid to try something different." There was a long silence. Elijah could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air. He looked around the room, seeing the skeptical expressions on most of their faces. But then, just as he was starting to think he wasn't going to get through to them, he noticed something. Mrs. Langley's eyes were shining with an unmistakable glimmer of hope. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, "I can't promise you anything today, but I think it's worth discussing further. Maybe it's time we started thinking outside the box." Mr. Peterson gave her a sharp look, clearly unhappy with her comment, but before he could speak, she added, "I'll arrange for a follow-up meeting with the school board. We'll present the results of Elijah's tutoring. We'll see if we can get some data to support his approach. If the students are really benefiting, maybe we can explore a pilot program, on a limited basis, of course." The room went silent again, and Elijah felt a rush of relief wash over him. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance to prove that this could work. Mr. Peterson was still visibly uncomfortable with the idea, but he gave a stiff nod. "Fine, we'll consider it, but understand that this is an extraordinary situation, and it's not going to be an easy path forward." Elijah nodded, determination burning in his chest. "I'm ready for whatever it takes." As he left the conference room, his heart was pounding with adrenaline. He hadn't won yet, but he'd made a crack in the wall, and cracks had a way of growing. That evening he met with Lucas, Brianna, and Aisha. They'd all heard the news from the petition and were anxious to hear how the meeting went. "They're considering a pilot program," Elijah said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "It's not a sure thing, but we've got a chance to prove it can work. We've got to keep pushing." Lucas grinned, punching Elijah lightly on the shoulder. "I knew you could do it, Mr. Turner," Brianna added. "You've inspired us, Elijah. You've given us a chance to show the world what we're capable of." Aisha nodded. "This isn't over. It's just the beginning." Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of the battle ahead. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Fighting for these kids, for this future, was worth every challenge. The week leading up to the school board's vote was nothing short of electric. It seemed like every hallway, every class period, every group chat was buzzing with the same question. "Do you think they'll say yes?" Elijah couldn't walk through the school without someone stopping him. Students, parents, even teachers now, offering encouragement or asking how they could help. The petition had reached over 1,200 signatures, and students were starting to organize. They created a website showcasing the progress they'd made, video testimonials from kids who had been struggling but were now passing their classes thanks to Elijah's methods. It was more than a campaign. It was a movement, and Elijah, he was the reluctant leader in the center of it all. On the morning of the vote, Elijah arrived at the school board auditorium to a sight he never expected. A line of students and parents outside the building, some holding handmade signs that read, "Let us learn our way. Turner for teacher. Education needs heart, not just rules." Inside, the meeting was already underway. Board members sat stiffly in a semicircle behind long desks. Mr. Peterson, as usual, looked like he had a headache just from the idea of innovation. Mrs. Langley gave Elijah a subtle nod when she spotted him near the back, standing tall in a worn-out but freshly pressed blazer. One of the board members, an older man with thick glasses and an old-school air, cleared his throat and spoke into the mic. "We're here to vote on a proposed pilot tutoring program led by Mr. Elijah Turner. It's unconventional. He is not a certified educator, but he has the support of over 1,200 community members and has demonstrated measurable impact in a short period of time." Mr. Peterson leaned forward. "Before we vote, I'd like to remind the board that any exception to district policy opens us to liability. We are talking about allowing an individual with no formal training to tutor students in a formal capacity." "Excuse me," a voice said from the back of the room. Heads turned. Elijah froze. It was Brianna. She was walking up the center aisle, holding a folder in one hand, a fire in her step that only comes from someone who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. "I know this isn't normal protocol," she said, looking directly at the board, "but I need to say something. You need to hear it from one of us, from the people you're voting about." The board glanced at each other. After a long moment, one of them nodded. "Go ahead." Brianna stepped forward and took a deep breath. "When Mr. Turner started helping us, I was failing calculus. Not because I didn't care, but because no one ever explained it in a way that made sense to me. I thought I was stupid, but then he showed up. He showed us that there wasn't just one way to learn. He believed in us when no one else did. And now I've got a B. I'm the first person in my family who might actually apply to college." She looked around, voice stronger now. "So yeah, maybe he doesn't have a certificate, but he has something more important. He sees us, and we need more people like that in our schools." There was a beat of silence, then applause. From the crowd, from the students outside who had squeezed in. Even a few teachers in the back were clapping. One board member dabbed at his eyes with a tissue. After a brief recess, the board returned to the room. Mr. Peterson called for order and took a deep breath. "We've deliberated. The board has voted." Elijah could feel his heart in his throat. In a 4-3 vote, the board has approved the creation of a limited pilot program, Mr. Peterson announced, visibly forcing the words out. "Mr. Elijah Turner will be permitted to lead after school, tutoring under the direct supervision of a licensed faculty member with quarterly evaluations for results and compliance." Gasps and cheers erupted through the room. They did it. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. A start. A foothold in the wall. Elijah sat down, shoulders dropping as the adrenaline gave way to disbelief. Students hugged each other. Lucas practically tackled him in celebration when the crowd spilled outside the building. "You did it, man," Lucas shouted. "You actually changed their minds." Elijah shook his head, smiling. "We did it, all of us." As the crowd started to thin and the press began to pack up, Mrs. Langley walked over. "Congratulations," she said, her voice quiet and sincere. "You just made district history." Elijah laughed softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't set out to, I couldn't watch those kids fall through the cracks anymore." "You didn't just stop the fall," she said. "You built a ladder." That night, Elijah sat alone on the bleachers overlooking the school football field, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His phone buzzed. Aisha had posted a video recap of the day's events. Comments were pouring in from across the country. Teachers, students, parents, all saying the same thing. "We need more teachers like Elijah Turner." He looked out at the empty field, at the school that had once mocked him, the system that tried to shut him out. And now? He had cracked it open. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? The Monday after the vote felt different. The halls looked the same. The floors were still a little too shiny. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, and the cafeteria still smelled like overcooked tater tots. But the energy? The way students looked at Elijah as he walked in? That had changed. He was no longer just the janitor who could do calculus. He was Mr. Turner, officially recognized as part of the school's educational team. Sort of. His new role wasn't glamorous. The board had approved a pilot program, not a full-time teaching position. That meant his classroom was actually a shared space. Half storage room, half study lounge tucked behind the library. It had old folding chairs, a whiteboard with one good marker and no windows, but to Elijah it felt like a dream. He was standing at the front of the room when the first group of students trickled in after school. Aisha, Lucas, Brianna, and a handful of others who had become the core crew were first through the door. Aisha dropped her bag and grinned. "This place is ugly," she said, glancing around. "But it's ours," Elijah laughed. "You're not wrong." They dove straight. In calculus, chemistry, even literature, Elijah didn't limit the topics. He wasn't a licensed teacher, but he was a learner. And more than that, he was a listener. He let the students guide the pace. If someone got stuck, they'd slow down. If someone figured something out, they'd turn and teach the others. The classroom wasn't a lecture hall, it was a lab of trust and growth. But not everyone was happy. Mr. Carter hadn't said much since the board vote. He avoided Elijah in the hall, and when they passed each other, there was a tightness in his jaw that said more than words ever could. On Tuesday afternoon, as Elijah left the tutoring room, he found Carter leaning against the wall just outside. "You must be feeling real proud of yourself," Carter said, not looking up. Elijah paused, backpack slung over one shoulder. "I'm proud of them. The students did the hard part." Carter finally looked up, his voice sharp. "You don't belong here, Turner. You think just because a few kids passed a quiz that makes you qualified?" Elijah's expression stayed calm. "I never said I was better than anyone, Mr. Carter. But the kids, your kids, they're learning now. Isn't that the goal?" Carter shook his head. "This isn't a movie, Elijah. You don't just walk in, flip a few tables, and save the day. Teaching is a profession. You're a tourist here." Those words stung more than Elijah expected. Because deep down he wondered the same thing sometimes. Was he really making a difference or just lighting a fire that would burn out? He didn't say anything else. He just walked away, trying not to let the doubt dig in too deep. Later that night he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by half-graded practice tests and notes from the students. His phone buzzed with a text from Brianna. "Brianna, check the school forum. You're trending again." With a sigh, Elijah clicked the link. His eyes widened. A teacher had posted anonymously, criticizing the board's decision to allow a janitor to take over education duties. The post accused Elijah of being a dangerous precedent, someone who encouraged shortcut learning and emotional manipulation. And worse, The post had comments, some from parents, some from staff, some were agreeing. Elijah stared at the screen for a long time, heat rising in his chest. He had worked so hard to prove himself, to show that it wasn't about titles, it was about connection. But now he was being treated like a threat. The next day he showed up earlier than usual. He beat the son to school, needing the quiet. Needing to remind himself why he was doing this, he went to the tiny storage room classroom and sat in one of the cheap plastic chairs, pulled out a dry erase marker, wrote 3 words across the board, let them rise. One by one, the students filtered in. They were louder now, more confident. Their laughs echoed louder in the halls. Aisha brought in donuts. Lucas slapped a printed copy of the anonymous forum post on the table. "We saw what they said," Lucas muttered, "and we're not letting them take you down." Elijah looked at them, so young and so full of fire. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. At the end of that day, one of the teachers, Ms. Dalton, an English teacher, stopped by his room. She leaned against the doorframe. "You're stirring. The pot, Turner." "I'm not trying to," he said. "I just want them to have a shot," she smirked. "That's exactly why you're dangerous. Keep going." And then she handed him something. A packet. It was a study guide with a note. "Thought this might help for the midterm group prep. I'm with you." D. Elijah smiled. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. Midterms at Westwood. Junior high were always a big deal, but this year, they were everything. For Elijah and his students, these exams weren't just about passing or failing, they were about proving the program worked. The school board had made it clear. If the students in the pilot program didn't show measurable improvement, the whole thing would be scrapped. Elijah would be out. And everything they'd built? Gone. No pressure, right? On the Monday before midterms, Elijah gathered his core group after school. The vibe was tense, books everywhere, highlighters uncapped, energy drinks half-chugged, and stress on every face. "We've got 4 days," Elijah said, pacing the room. "This isn't about being perfect. It's about showing them what we know, what we've learned, and how we've grown." Lucas groaned, slouching in his chair. "I haven't slept in like 2 days. My brain is leaking out my ears, bro." "You have a brain?" Aisha teased, tossing him a granola bar. "That's new." Brianna smiled, but Elijah could see the nerves in her eyes. The truth was, they were all feeling it. Brianna had worked the hardest, staying late every day, building color-coded flashcards and group quizzes. Aisha had turned into a mini-coach, leading peer study groups when Elijah wasn't around. And Lucas, well, he still complained, but he'd gone from failing algebra to tutoring others in it. They'd come so far, but Elijah couldn't shake the doubt creeping in. That night he sat alone at home, flipping through their mock test results. Most of them were improving, some significantly. But there were still a few who struggled, and he couldn't help but feel like he was letting them down, like if they didn't all succeed, none of it mattered. He opened his laptop, staring at a blank message to the school board. Subject: midterm forecast body. What could he say? "I'm trying my best?" That wouldn't cut it. He closed the laptop. Tuesday and Wednesday were a blur. Review sessions, practice problems, one-on-ones. Elijah barely had time to eat, but the students kept showing up, tired, stressed, but there. That alone said something. On Thursday afternoon, the last review session before the exams, Elijah handed out one final practice test. "Think of this like a scrimmage," he said. "Game day is tomorrow." Brianna raised her hand. "And if we bomb this?" "You won't," Elijah said, "because we don't fail. We learn." After they finished, Aisha lingered behind. "Hey, Elijah." "Yeah," she hesitated. "Thanks for not giving up on us." Elijah smiled. "You gave me a reason not to." Friday, game day. The school hallways were quieter than usual. Students shuffled into classrooms, eyes wide, pencils sharpened, nerves on high. Elijah wasn't allowed to be in the room during testing. It was official district policy, but he waited in the hallway, pacing like a coach outside a championship locker room. Midterms lasted hours. He watched the door, hoping, praying, sweating bullets. When Lucas emerged first, he looked pale but determined. I think I didn't screw it up," he said. Blinking like he couldn't believe it, Aisha came next, practically skipping. I killed that chemistry section. Let's go, Brianna. She was last, quiet, focused. She walked up to Elijah slowly, hugged him without a word, then whispered, I left nothing behind. Whatever happens now, I gave it everything. That weekend was brutal. Elijah tried to stay busy, grading other assignments, cleaning his place, running errands, but his mind kept circling back to one thing. What if it wasn't enough? Monday morning results were released. He didn't even get through the front doors before Lucas ran up to him, waving his phone. B-, bro. In algebra. That's the highest grade I've ever had. Inside the library classroom, more news came in. Aisha, 86% in chemistry. Brianna, 92% in calculus. Even students who had struggled the most, passing. For the first time, by third period, word had spread. Students from other classes were peeking in, asking about the pilot program. Teachers were taking notice. Mrs. Dalton stopped by with a grin and a simple, well done. Then his phone buzzed, email from Westwood School Board, subject, pilot program. Update. His heart thudded in his chest as he opened it. Mr. Turner, we've reviewed the results of the recent midterms, and the data is clear. The students in your pilot program demonstrated an average improvement of 22%. Several achieved their highest scores to date. The board will reconvene next month to discuss expanding the program further. For now, we commend your work and the positive impact you've had on our students. Respectfully, Westwood District Board. Elijah sat back in his chair, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. He looked around at the students who were now laughing, high-fiving, full of life. They had done it. Not perfectly, not easily, but together. That afternoon, he picked up a marker and added a new line to the whiteboard under the old one. Let them rise. And underneath it, they did. Elijah's students had crushed their midterms, and for a few brief days it felt like everything was finally falling into place. Teachers who had once side-eyed him now nodded when they passed him in the halls. Parents emailed him with thank yous. The tutoring room was full every afternoon, not just with students who needed help, but with students who wanted to be there. It felt like a win. But the thing about success is, it makes people uncomfortable, especially the ones who feel like they're being replaced. On Wednesday morning, the email came. It was short, clinical, cold, from Vice Principal. Kinsey, subject, immediate suspension of pilot program activities, Mr. Turner, effective immediately. All tutoring sessions under the pilot program are suspended pending a formal review. This is not a disciplinary action, but a pause in activity due to concerns raised by faculty regarding equity, curriculum deviation, and procedural compliance. You are not to conduct any further instruction or tutoring sessions until further notice. Regards, VP Kinsey. Elijah stared at the screen, stunned. What the hell? He immediately headed to the main office, heart pounding in his chest. Mrs. Langley wasn't in. The secretary just shrugged when he asked if there was a meeting. All I know is there were some complaints filed, she said without looking up. When Elijah got back to the tutoring room, the students were already there, buzzing with confusion. What's going on? Lucas asked. Why is the door locked? I got suspended, Elijah said, keeping his voice even. Not fired, not disciplined, but they're hitting pause. Brianna's face twisted with disbelief. But why? We just proved it works. Elijah shook his head slowly. Someone doesn't want it to. It didn't take long for the rumor mill to start churning. By lunch, word spread that a group of faculty members had filed a formal complaint against the pilot. Not because of student performance, but because of equity issues. The idea that students outside the pilot program weren't receiving the same level of engagement. It was a political move. Not about the students, not about education. Just power. That night, Elijah met with Mrs. Langley. She looked exhausted. I fought them on this, she said, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. But once the formal complaint was filed, my hands were tied. Who did it? She hesitated, then finally sighed. Peterson, and a few others from the faculty union, Carter included. Of course. Elijah clenched his jaw. They're not attacking your results, she added. They're attacking your presence. They see what's happening. They see kids choosing your sessions over theirs. They feel threatened. Elijah rubbed his face. So what happens now? There's a review hearing next Friday. The board wants to evaluate the program, the results, and the legal risk. If they feel it's too controversial or disruptive, they'll shut it down, officially. Back at home. Elijah sat in silence for hours. He thought about all the students who had finally started to believe in themselves, about the kids who didn't speak in class until they were in his room, about the walls they had torn down, only to have them built right back up. He picked up his phone and texted one word to the group chat, Elijah, we fight. By morning, the campaign had already begun. Aisha launched a social media blitz, marked Let Them Learn Lucas, filmed a TikTok where he broke down his old test grades versus his new ones, and it blew up overnight. Brianna wrote a blog post that got picked up by a local education newsletter, Why My Janitor Turned Tutor Taught Me More Than My Textbooks Ever Did. Within 48 hours, students were organizing a sit-in at the school, peaceful, powerful. They wore tape over their mouths with one message written on it. We deserve a voice. Peterson was livid. He called it disruptive, a media stunt. But what he couldn't deny, the local press had shown up, and now the whole city was watching. That Friday, the district board met early. Elijah wasn't allowed inside the closed-door session, but he stood outside with the students, listening through the glass as dozens of them gave their statements, one by one. Brianna, you say you want to put students first, so listen to us. Aisha, I learned to believe in myself because of this program. If you take it away, you're telling me that belief didn't matter. Lucas, I was failing. Now I'm not. That's all the data you need. Mrs. Langley emerged hours later, looking both exhausted and hopeful. They're rattled, she said, but I think you've got a shot. Elijah nodded. Then we keep going. That night, Elijah walked through the empty school hallways, past the classrooms, past the janitor's closet where he once mopped floors, and listened to lectures through cracked doors. He reached the locked tutoring room. He stared at it and smiled, because the door might be locked now, but they had already broken it open. The hearing was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp, but by 6:15, the parking lot outside the Westwood Unified District Office was already packed. Students, parents, teachers, reporters, they all came. Some carried signs. Some wore T-shirts that said, Let Them Learn. Some just came to listen, but everyone knew. This wasn't just about a tutoring program anymore. It was about what education should be, and who was allowed to teach. Inside, the boardroom was transformed. Cameras were mounted in the corners. A podium stood in the center. Fold-out chairs had been added to the back rows. The board members sat like judges on a panel, stoic, unreadable, already weary from the noise. At 7:02, Vice Principal Kinsey cleared her throat and addressed the room. We are here to review the impact and future of the pilot program initiated by Mr. Elijah Turner. Tonight we'll hear testimony from faculty, students, and Mr. Turner himself. She looked up. Elijah, please begin. Elijah stood slowly. He wasn't in a suit, no tie, just a collared shirt, sleeves rolled up, and a wristwatch that used to belong to his father, a reminder of where he came from. He approached the podium, paused, and looked out at the room. So many eyes, so many expectations. Then he spoke. I'm not a certified teacher. I didn't go to school for this. I didn't plan to become an educator. I started here pushing a mop. A few chuckles rippled across the back row. He waited, then continued. But something happened. A student, Aisha, saw me solving a problem on a board, and instead of laughing or ignoring me like most did, she asked me to explain it. That single question started a ripple I never expected. He looked directly at Mr. Peterson. I didn't ask to teach. I was invited to teach by the students. He paused, letting it land. I don't pretend to know everything, but I know what it's like to feel invisible in a system that wasn't built for you. And I know these kids, the ones behind me, the ones in the hallway, the ones you don't even notice. They are capable of so much more than their grades suggest, if you meet them where they are. He picked up a folder from the podium and held it up. These are the midterm results. Data. Hard numbers. Students in the program improved an average of 22%. Some of them passed for the first time ever. Not because I taught them differently, but because I treated them like they mattered. He placed the folder down. And yet here we are, not celebrating that success, but trying to shut it down because it doesn't fit into the neat box of how we've always done things. He glanced around the room, voice steady. But education isn't about boxes, it's about breakthroughs. A quiet filled the room. Then the floor opened for public comment, and what followed was a tsunami. Aisha stepped up to the mic first. I used to be scared of raising my hand. Now I lead study groups. Mr. Turner didn't just teach me equations. He showed me I'm worth teaching. Lucas. I failed math 3 years in a row. Now I'm passing. You can't fake that. Brianna. I'm applying to college next year. I wrote about Elijah in my personal statement because he changed the way I see myself. Even Ms. Dalton, the English teacher, took the mic. I've taught for over 20 years. I've seen dozens of programs come and go. But what Elijah is doing, it's real. You don't need a certificate to care. You need courage. He's got that in spades. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When his turn came, he stood with all the stiffness of a man clinging to a crumbling wall. I'm not denying Mr. Turner's impact, he said. But schools operate under structure, protocol. If we let anyone with good intentions start leading programs, where do we draw the line? There were murmurs in the crowd. Elijah stood. You draw the line. Where impact ends. At 9:18 p.m., the board retreated to deliberate. Outside, students and parents waited in the hallway, some seated cross-legged on the floor, some scrolling social media where clips from the hearing were already going viral. Inside the chamber, silence. Then movement. The board returned. Mrs. Langley stepped forward to read the decision. After reviewing the academic data, student testimonials, faculty input, and program impact, the board has reached a unanimous decision. Elijah's hands curled into fists. Effective immediately, the pilot program will be fully reinstated. Furthermore, we are expanding the program into a school-wide initiative, with Mr. Elijah Turner appointed as its lead educational advisor, under a special district certification waiver. For a second, there was only silence. Then, the room erupted. Cheers, applause. A few people even cried. Aisha flung her arms around Elijah. Lucas jumped like he'd won the lottery. Brianna just smiled, tears streaking her cheeks. You did it, she whispered. Elijah looked around at the crowd, overwhelmed. We did it. Outside, under the flickering streetlights, he took one last look back at the boardroom, the place that had tried to shut him out. And now, they had handed him a key. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It was the first day of the new semester at Westwood Junior High. Snow still lingered on the grass outside, turning to slush. Near the sidewalks, but inside, the building buzzed with a kind of electricity. Not the kind that came from fear of tests or the usual New Year nerves. This buzz was hope. Elijah stood at the front steps, same as he had every morning before. But this time, he wasn't wearing janitor blues. He wore a badge on his chest that read Elijah Turner, Educational Advisor Student Enrichment Program. Crazy, huh? Aisha said, walking up beside him, her backpack slung low over one shoulder. You used to be the dude pushing a mop. Now you've got an office. Barely, Elijah chuckled. It's technically a converted supply closet with a window, but hey, it's got Wi-Fi. She grinned and nudged him. It's not about the room, it's about who's in it. Word of the pilot program's success had gone beyond the district. Local news stations had done features. A few educational non-profits reached out. Even a university professor invited Elijah to speak on a panel about non-traditional educators. But Elijah, he didn't care about the spotlight. He cared about that kid in the back of the classroom who didn't believe they were smart until someone showed them otherwise. His first class of the semester, officially titled Foundations Lab, was scheduled right after lunch. No grades, no tests, just exploration, problem-solving, mentorship. The sign above the classroom door had been hand-painted by Lucas and, Brianna over winter break, it read, "Where you begin doesn't decide where you end." As students trickled in, Elijah greeted each by name. Lucas brought in 2 new freshmen he'd been tutoring on the side. Brianna showed off her college acceptance letter, NYU full ride. Aisha, she had created an online community called Study Up, where Westwood students could help each other with homework. Over 200 members and growing, and every time Elijah looked around that room, he saw something new. Leaders, thinkers, proof. Midway through class, Elijah asked a question. "All right," he said, leaning on the edge of a desk. "Real talk. What's one thing you wish every teacher, principal, parent, heck, the whole world understood about you?" The room went quiet for a moment. Then Brianna raised her hand. "That we're not broken. We're just waiting for someone to believe. We're worth fixing with." Elijah nodded, throat tight. "Exactly." Later that week, Elijah passed Mr. Carter in the hallway, the man who had once mocked him, challenged him, tried to shut him down. Carter paused. "Turner." Elijah stopped. Carter looked him in the eye. "You proved me wrong." Elijah didn't gloat. He just smiled quietly. "It wasn't about proving you wrong. It was about showing them what's possible." Carter gave a single, reluctant nod. "Well, you did." And with that, he walked. On Friday afternoon, Elijah walked the halls alone after dismissal. He paused outside the janitor's closet, his old domain. He opened the door, stepped inside. Everything was just how he left it. Shelves of cleaning supplies, the scent of bleach, the echo of silence. He reached up and grabbed the old chalkboard he used to practice on, tucked behind mops and buckets, dusty but still there. He smiled, picked up a piece of chalk and wrote 3 words, "Let them rise." As he turned to leave, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Mrs. Langley. "You're not cleaning floors anymore, Elijah," she said softly. "You're changing lives." He smiled at her. "I think those might be the same thing." Outside, snow had started to fall again, but inside Westwood Junior High something much warmer had taken root. Not just a program, not just a change in policy, a belief that everyone, no matter what uniform they wear, what grades they've gotten, or where they come from, deserves a chance to rise. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?